Hanoi, 2025. Ta Hien Street, 8 p.m. The tropical heat, a stifling 32 degrees, clung to the skin like a wet, invisible membrane. Mark sat hunched on a low blue plastic stool, his knees pressing against his chin, his hand instinctively clutching his wallet. Around him, chaos was unfolding on an industrial scale. The thumping bass of club music clashed violently with the distorted cry of a street vendor selling boiled peanuts. The air was thick, a pungent cocktail of sour beer, charred pork fat, and the sweat of hundreds of bodies grinding against each other in an alleyway barely 5 meters wide. Mark was a process optimization expert from Berlin. He was paid handsomely to identify errors. And here, he saw errors everywhere. Population density, 300% overcapacity. Fire exits, non-existent. Hygiene standards, 0. According to every law of physics and workplace safety he held dear, this street should be gridlocked, or exploding. An old woman appeared, moving against the current. A bamboo yoke rested on her frail shoulders, balancing 2 heavy pots of tofu dessert. Mark held his breath. He calculated the trajectory. A collision was imminent. She was on a direct path to crash into a group of young men toasting with beer mugs. Thud. It wasn't a loud crash, just the dull, dry sound of the bamboo yoke hitting the bare shoulder of a tattooed man. Sticky, amber-colored ginger syrup sloshed out, splattering onto the man's arm. It dripped down his skin, slow and viscous. Almost immediately, a few flies materialized from the humid air, buzzing greedily around the sweet, sticky trail. Mark flinched, bracing for a fight, or at least an outburst. But nothing happened. The young man simply muttered a curse, then casually wiped the sticky mess onto his jeans with the back of his hand. The old woman mumbled something under her breath, adjusted her yoke, and shuffled on. The flies followed the man. The flow of people healed itself instantly, like water parting and rejoining around a stone. No one stopped. No one cared. The violation of personal space here was accepted as a fundamental law of nature. Mark drained his beer. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. It wasn't the beer. It was the stickiness of the syrup, the buzzing of the flies, the raw, unfiltered friction of flesh. He had lived in Vietnam for 3 years, drawing hundreds of clean, linear flowcharts for factories. But tonight, sitting in this organic, pulsating mess, he felt a primal fear. He was afraid of this chaotic vitality. It was a monster that he could never optimize. The unease followed Mark back to his high-end apartment in Westlake. His home was a fortress of order. The imported German oak floors were dust-free. The temperature was a constant, climate-controlled 24 degrees. Everything was square, aligned, and sterile. But that perfection was now being challenged by an object he had just brought home. A ceramic vase. He had bought it that afternoon at a contemporary art gallery. Truth be told, he hadn't bought it because he liked it. He bought it because it offended him. Amidst the glossy lacquerware and polished sculptures, this vase stood like an insult to quality control. It was the color of mist, a pale, ethereal blue. But the entire surface of the glaze was shattered. Thousands of dark, jagged cracks ran across it like unhealed scars. "This is a firing defect," Mark had told the gallery manager, his voice clipped with professional authority. The middle-aged woman had looked at him, her eyes indifferent. "It is not a defect, it is crackled glaze." "It's cracked," Mark pointed to the largest fissure. "If I poured water in this, it would seep out. Physically, its structure is compromised." "If you want to hold water, buy a plastic bottle," she retorted, her voice cool. "This is made to hold time. The fire burns at 1,200 degrees, then we open the kiln suddenly. The cold air rushes in. The thermal shock tears the glaze apart. We leave it exactly as it is." Mark stared at her as if she were insane. "You break it on purpose?" "We don't break it. We let the fire decide. If the cracks are even, we keep it. If it shatters, we crush it. And you sell this for $500? If you don't want it, put it down. Someone else is waiting. Mark had bought it, not out of appreciation, but out of a need to dominate it. He couldn't stand the thought that something so broken could be considered a standard. He bought it to study it, to prove it was wrong. And now, in his pristine kitchen, Mark was processing it. He wore yellow rubber gloves. He was armed with industrial detergent and a toothbrush. He scrubbed furiously at the black cracks. He wanted to clean them. He wanted to fix the error. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, useless. The blackness is deep under the glass-like glaze. It was Indian ink, rubbed into the very bone of the clay by the artisan. Mark threw the toothbrush onto the floor. The plastic clattered loudly in the silent room. The vase stood there on the counter, rough, distorted, defiant. It was like a malignant tumor metastasizing in his perfect living space. It was beautiful in a strange, infuriating way. A beauty that made him angry, yet he couldn't look away. That night, sleep evaded Mark. The presence of the vase in the next room triggered another memory, another crack in his reality that he had witnessed earlier that day. 12 noon, at his office. Mark was on a video call with the Berlin headquarters, needing a figure from the accounting department. He stepped out of his glass office. The lights were off. The entire floor was plunged into darkness. Mark froze. On the floor, right under the ergonomic desks, his 50 Vietnamese employees were sleeping. They had rolled out straw mats, sheets of cardboard, even raincoats. They lay packed together like sardines in a tin. The sound of rhythmic breathing and soft snoring filled the air. A surge of anger rose in Mark's chest. This was an A-grade office, not a refugee camp. "Hey!" Mark opened his mouth to shout. "Wake up! Work hours!" "Shh!" A sharp hiss cut through the air from the corner. The HR manager, the woman who smiled brightly at him every morning, lifted her head from a pillow made of her backpack. Her eyes, usually warm, were now cold and warning. "Quiet," she whispered, but the tone was a command. "People need to sleep." Then she lay back down, turning her back to him. Mark stood rooted to the spot. He was the boss. He had the power to fire them. But in that moment, he felt like the intruder. That mass of sleeping bodies, they were not 50 separate individuals. They were a single organism, a giant creature breathing in unison. They protected each other's sleep with a ruthless law of silence. If he turned on the lights, if he made a sound, he would be the enemy of the entire village. Mark retreated into his glass box, closing the door softly. He sat down, his heart pounding. He realized that the warmth and friendliness he saw every day was just a veneer. Beneath it lay a mechanism of extreme collective control, a system ready to crush any individual, even the boss, if they dared to go against the biological rhythm of the community. Mark returned to the living room. 3 a.m. The vase was still there. His annoyance had mutated into obsession. Why did they worship the cracks? Why did they protect the chaos? He picked up the vase and turned it upside down. He wanted to find a label, a barcode, anything that belonged to the civilized world he understood. No barcode, only a faded red stamp, hand-carved and stamped messily on the bottom. The ink was blurred, hard to read. Mark squinted. Lo Ong Sao, Mr. Sao's kiln. That was it. No address, no website. Mark shook the vase hard. Something rattles inside. He tipped it over. A crumpled ball of paper fell out. It was likely trash or packing paper the artisan had stuffed inside to keep its shape during firing and forgot to remove. Mark unfolded the yellowed, brittle paper. It felt like it would disintegrate in his fingers. It was a scrap of the Hanoi Moi, New Hanoi newspaper, stained brown with age. He read the date in the corner, December 2005. Mark looked at the scrap of newsprint, then at the stamp, Lo Ong Sao. 20 years. This vase had existed for 20 years. It wasn't new. Was it dead stock? or something dug up from a pile of debris. Mark grabbed his phone. He typed, Lo Ong Sao Bat Trang. Google returned. No results found. He typed, crackled glaze bat trang. Google flooded the screen with millions of results. Shiny online shops, pottery tours for tourists. All clean, all modern. Nothing looked like the place that birthed this distorted, cracked object. Mark lowered the phone. He looked out the window. Hanoi was still glowing below, a sea of city lights. But now, it felt more alien than ever. He had lived here for 3 years, yet he had never touched it. He had only skated on its glossy surface. This vase and this piece of trash paper were a trapdoor leading to the basement, a place with no Google Maps, a place with no ISO procedures, a place that might be filthy, chaotic, and dangerous. A shiver ran down Mark's spine. A vague fear crept into his mind. He wasn't sure he wanted to go down there. He feared that if he stepped into that chaotic world, the order in his mind would shatter, just like the glaze. But he knew he couldn't throw this vase away. It was a thorn that had embedded itself deep in his flesh, and to pull it out, he had to find the fire that made it. Become a guardian of these memories.